What am I telling you?
Introduce yourself
Okay.
and tell me where we are.
Okay. Um, I'm Rochelle Frich, and we are currently in room 2A at the Milwaukee Public Library, Central Library downtown. Um,
So before we get into all of it, did your mom know this story?
I don't know. I don't see if I'm talking about stuff I don't know, like that's it. Like, did you actually know this happened? Or it goes back to the other thing. Who decided to stop telling this story? You know, did Wiley just like say, well, we're going to move on and press on and that's behind us. We're going to work as hard as we can.
I don't want you to remember this.
Yes.
Let's start our new life.
I don't know. Somebody, someplace in that line decided to stop telling the story. And when does that happen?
And what happens is someone down the line is going to start looking for that story.
Yes.
That's you.
It's like, I just want to know who my people are. And now there's this whole incident, and Mark Twain's writing about it. I just wanted some answers.
Hi, I'm Ron Stodgill, publisher of Detour. Welcome to the Detour Podcast, the first in a series of podcasts that explores Black people's relationship to place around the world. We pride ourselves on going off the beaten track to tell amazing stories about Black people. I'm really excited about this story because it reflects so much of our mission, which is partly to tell stories about familiar places and not so familiar places, but through a Black lens. This story takes us from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Pierce City, Missouri, the home of Rochelle Frich's ancestors. So I came across Rochelle and her story while doing some research on Black communities displaced by violence. In doing so, I came across the surname Godley. It was an unusual name. They're a Black family from Pierce City. I started doing some Googling, and I was led to a really cool blog, The Late Arrival.
A blog? I love it.
This is my producer, Christopher Houston.
Hi, Ron. So what do you know about Rochelle?
Well, I know she's a writer. She blogs about her life. She works at a nonprofit called Pearls for teen girls in Milwaukee. She's married to her husband, Jamie, who's white, for 20 years, and their daughter, Georgia. She's in college. Rochelle is so proud of Georgia. So proud.
That is so sweet.
It is sweet. And so she blogs about her upbringing and her relatives, what it's like being Black in Milwaukee, and then also about her journey to find out how she wound up in Milwaukee. And in particular, why no one in her family ever talked about it.
Wow, it definitely sounds like a good story.
Yes, it is a good story, and it ties to a small town in rural southwest Missouri called Pierce City, a sundown town that has a terrible past and a particular event that everyone wants to forget.
Wow. So what is a sundown town again?
Well, sundown towns are all white communities where Black people are not welcome. They are discriminated against with laws and harassment and violence. So, that's why I reached out to you, to be quite honest, Chris. Missouri is a tough place to tell this story. Sundown towns, they still exist in a way. In this town that Rochelle traces her roots to, it still has zero population of Black people. Pierce City is a sundown town that hasn't come back from the moment it became one.
Wow. Then yes, we want to help Rochelle tell her story. So I will go to Milwaukee and to Pierce City to dig into this more. Are you ready?
Let's get into it. This series is an exploration into one woman's journey to find out where her family came from, why that story has been so hush-hush for over a century.
Let's start the story in Pierce City in 1901. It's Sunday, August 18th, and the Methodist Church had just let out in Pierce City, Missouri. Gisela Wild, who's 23, wants to get moving home to start helping out with dinner. Her family's house is just a little trip from town, along railroad tracks, and through the rural landscape rich with farmland. So she shouts to her brother, Carl, that she's going on ahead, while he stays behind to hang out with some friends. Onward, Gisela walks toward the outskirts of town, passing by the distant farmhouses on large properties of families she probably knows. It's when she approaches a culvert that she is attacked. She fights back, breaking a finger in the struggle. If anyone is around, they are likely not close enough to hear her yelling for help. Gisela's brother Carl is not too far behind at this point, but he stops at a friend's house first. Back at the culvert, the attacker struggles to contain Gisela, possibly trying to pull her out of sight to rape her. Perhaps sensing that Gisela was only one kick or a well-landed elbow away from breaking loose, the attacker pulls out a knife and cuts Gisela's throat. She's left lying there, Bible and parasol nearby. Gisela's brother comes up just a few minutes later and spots his sister. He runs to her as she is breathing her last breaths and has a gash on her head. He runs for help. Gisela Wild has been murdered, and the next 36 hours in Pierce City will result in more bloodshed and forever change the identity of this southern Missouri community, even to this day. A community 110 years later, Rochelle Frich will discover her connection to. Let's go catch back up with Rochelle and her daughter Georgia in Milwaukee. At what point did you start wondering where your ancestry came from?
I think that's back to when my daughter was 6. She's coming back from school, and they would like to do like these ethnic fairs.
What are those?
Like around the world. So, okay, here's Irish over here. Here's this and that. Well, she's 6. She's biracial. So she's trying to figure all this out, right? Okay, so I go to pick up Georgia. You said, I told them I'm Hawaiian. And I'm like,
no.
why would you say that you're Hawaiian? And you said, because I like pineapples.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know what was wrong with me, but I really did think I was Hawaiian. Yeah, I don't remember. I said that to people.
Yeah, you said you told people that you were Hawaiian.
I feel bad.
Because you like pineapple. It was so
That's
pure.
such a 6-year-old answer,
Okay.
yeah.
It was so pure. And so that got my wheels turning, not because I didn't want her to think that she's Hawaiian. That's okay. But I'm like, really? You need to know where you come from.
Rochelle says when she was a kid growing up in Milwaukee, in her home, no one talked about where they came from.
The house that we grew up in, it was very spacious, and I liked the floor in the breezeway when you'd walk in. It was like these different shades of browns and reds, like a rectangle mosaic, and for some reason I was fixated on that floor, and I just loved it. And we had a full dining room and a kitchen that was small, and you could, all the windows in the dining room and the kitchen, you could see out into the backyard.
In your blog post, you mentioned how great grandparents aren't really brought up too much or mentioned too frequently, but you would hear conversations.
Mm-hmm.
What did you hear and who was talking?
I can tell you that it was conversations between my mother and her surviving sister, Josephine. After church on Sundays, we'd always have a big Sunday dinner. Joe would come over. And so I'd hear her and my mom like talking about when they were kids and living wherever they lived. I think where they live now, that area, as an aside, is the freeway. That's a whole other issue of Milwaukee.
Mm.
There was the thriving Black community. Make way for progress.
For the freeway. Mm.
Anyway, I'd hear them talking about like seriously different members of the family. And so I like have this clear memory of these really obscure names. There's like Cousin Adolphus and Cousin Hobart, Lillian, Fanny, all these people.
names.
Yes, Wiley, French. These are like the most obscure names, and maybe that's why they like stick with me. And every now and then, I would hear the two of them get into a disagreement about whether it's Mildred and Ricky. And I mean, all these like, oh no, but you know that so and so did whatever. No, he didn't. And well, you know, Hobart's a teetotaler. And it's like, what is going on? French, that one conversation I referred to, I clearly remember that. It was French Godly.
Did you ever ask your mom about these names?
No, it was, and I kick myself now because like there's this whole cloud of names, and for me, it was just like the TV's on, whatever. They're just throwing out all these names.
Mr. Murray Bischoff, journalist here in Pierce City. How did you first come across the Godley story?
So, there was a lady whose father had a hardware store downtown. And Catherine Platt, went to the nursing home. Catherine had been a pack rat. And people who handled her estate went through her house and created a sale to create some funds to help pay for her staying in the nursing home. And among the things that were in her home was a clipping from the Joplin Globe that described the lynching in 1901, the Globe's account. And that document, which was of the different accounts, a pretty good one, and gave one of the better general overviews of what happened, was recognized for what it was and taken to the public library.
Okay. Let's get you to introduce yourself real quick.
Okay, my name is Murray Bischoff. I'm a newspaper man. I work at the Monette Times. I've been there for 32 years. I started in January of 1988, and I do a little bit of everything. I write stories, I take pictures, I cover meetings, I write the only weekly editorial column that appears in the paper, and I fill in on occasion taking pictures at football games and covering events.
There is a lot to unpack here, and Murray is a very detailed storyteller. So I'll summarize a bit to get us to the next point. After Murray discovers the article about a lynching in Pierce City with the name Godley in it, he starts digging more at the public library. And there he comes across the murder of Gisela Wild. Remember, she is the 23-year-old white woman we heard about earlier who was attacked and murdered on her way home from church in Pierce City in 1901.
It was in the public library one afternoon that I came across this. And I was flabbergasted, not only by what had happened, but how such a thing could happen, and even where such a thing could happen, because it just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. Even the description of where Gisela was killed was so alien to my understanding of why anybody would be there. It took me quite a long time to even locate where the lime kiln had been or anything down in that end of town. So I actually walked down there one day looking for it to try to piece all this together. So I wrestled around with what in the world had happened for some time. And then I decided there's more to this. Let me look at the other accounts. And so I started looking at other newspaper accounts, and they didn't all line up. In fact, they all took a different angle, and some of them were contradictory to get a big picture. And so then I decided, well, I need to gather every account that I can find. And maybe if I put them all together, I'll get a better picture for what took place.
All right, so we have two big mysteries taking place. One is, how did Rochelle's family end up in Milwaukee? And the second is, who killed Gisela Wild? As Murray pores through the archival microfilm from the newspapers in 1901, he finds Gisela Wild's death immediately sent a wave of outrage through the town. And when I say immediately, I mean within hours on that Sunday, August 18th. She is adorned as an angel. Prayers and poems are scribed in the newspapers about her. The thirst for justice courses through Pierce City. Its ripples even extend to surrounding communities. Murray finds out that as the word spreads that Sunday of Gisela Wild's murder, the hunt is on for the killer. Several people, plus some kids who had been swimming near the crime scene, say they had spotted a black man sitting on a culvert about 45 minutes before Gisela Wild had come by. Another boy said there were actually two men there. Search parties scour the area, only turning up Gisela's handkerchief about a quarter mile away from the murder scene. As the day wears on, city officials ring the fire bell to alert the residents of the murder. With no apparent answers yet, the townspeople grow agitated. Extra help is called in from nearby towns and cities to help investigate. At some point, two suspects' names jump into the conversation: 32-year-old Will Godley and 17-year-old Gene Barrett. Both are black. Will Godley is one of the town's usual suspects after being accused of rape 10 years earlier and then arrested on suspicion of murder just a few months prior. He was released after his alibi checked out, though. On Monday, the day after Gisela Wild was murdered, Will and Gene are taken into custody at the Pierce City jail. That was not enough for the people of Pierce City, though, or the trainloads of people coming in from out of town. The Monday edition of the Pierce City Empire newspaper read, "No crime should ever be let go unpunished, and every citizen should constitute himself an officer for the time being to help down the murderer." The uproar of what happened to Gisela Wild begins to surge as tensions rise. People cry and wonder how safe they are. Anger festers as they wonder who could do such a thing. Gun shops sell out. Crowds gather in the downtown street demanding justice. The Pierce City rage machine is picking up steam with its gaze toward the jail. I want to check back in with Rochelle. We've talked about her family not mentioning relatives except for peeps of names she heard as a child, like French Godley. But she also didn't have a lot of time to ask them as she grew into an adult. Rochelle is in her freshman year of college when her mom, her last connection to any direct answers she could get about her ancestry, gets pretty sick.
You know, she was like lethargic, and I knew something wasn't right. And I remember the only time I would even think of raising my voice at her, I did. "Why don't you go see a doctor? This is ridiculous, la, 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 la." And she says, "Honey, sit down." I'm like, "Okay. I think Mom might have cancer." Just like that. And I'm like,
Like referring to herself as
yes,
in the third.
yes, because it's easier to do that than to say I. Right? And I'm just like sitting there, and then there's tears. And she's like, "Oh no, honey, you're my strong one." She had liver cancer. From the day of diagnosis, she passed away, I want to say 3 weeks later. I actually had a Christmas concert that night at the Chapel of the Pines, or whatever it's called at Concordia, because I was in choir. And I came home and she had already gone. And because I'm like, why are all these people here? Because even though, and it's a crazy thing, even though I know that's a reality and a possibility, but when I'm looking at it, it's just like, why is everybody at the house? What's going on? Well, duh.
So without your mom around, who is the emotional anchor? Was it you?
Somebody had to plan the funeral, hold it together, keep the trains going, you know?
Rochelle's dad also dies thereafter, and she moves toward a new reality and starts to build her own family, putting her ancestry questions to the side. She meets Jamie at a karaoke bar and falls in love. They host a wedding with mostly Jamie's family attending. Rochelle didn't have that many around anymore, only one sibling attending. Rochelle gives birth to Georgia later that year. All the while, though, a tiny ember glows inside of her desire to know where she comes from. It never goes out, even though she's lost most of the people who could give her answers. Fast forward to Rochelle with a 6-year-old Georgia. Remember, she's thinking she's Hawaiian because she likes pineapple. That is when Rochelle's ember starts a fire again. So she comes up with a 2-part plan. Step 1, let's take a look at my genes.
Well, let's do this 23andMe thing, because at the time they were building their database of African Americans. So I'm like, and it was free. So I'm like, okay.
I'm on.
Hi. Check out that box. And so I did that, and it came back, and to me, the results were pretty not satisfying. It's like
What did they say?
It's 85% African. Well,
that's a continent.
Exactly. And then they narrowed it down to sub-Saharan African.
A large region now.
How helpful is that?
Not very much.
No, it's not.
Dead end there. Step 2, search online for those names she overheard as a child. Mary Jane, French Godly, Wiley Godly.
I was like, okay, let's try Ancestry, because they'll do the trial. Okay, let me punch something in. I do know my grandmother, and I know it was someplace in Missouri.
So you put Mary Jane
Godly, Missouri. Mm-hmm. And it's Lawrence County. I was like, oh, Neosho. Oh, Neosho. Okay. And that's really where it jumped off at that point.
All right, Ron, do you know where Neosho is?
Where?
About a half-hour west of Pierce City. That's where I'm going next in the series. Ground zero for what happens next in the Godly family story and what happened to the Black community in Pierce City.
Wow, Chris. Rochelle's story is amazing. It gives me so much to think about. I can't wait to see where her journey goes next. Thanks for listening to this Detour podcast and part 1 of Rochelle's story. I'm Ron Stodgill.